Hello, I'm Hare. I've been asked to give a talk about Hilaire Belloc, and I thought rather than give a standard PowerPoint presentation, it might be nice to actually come out to the areas that Belloc knew with my friend Chris, who's a former BBC cameraman, and he's filming me. So I hope this is something slightly different from a usual Zoom talk. And I must apologise for my lockdown hair, which as you can see is bountiful and blowing all around the place, so I'm hoping to get that cut in a week or two, so I hope that doesn't distract you, and I hope you enjoy what I have to tell you in the next 50 minutes or so. Today I'm going to talk to you about Hilaire Belloc, who was a well-known writer, controversialist, one-time politician, poet, who lived most of his life in the county of Sussex as a boy at Slindon and as a man at Shipley near Horsham. Hilaire Belloc was born of an English mother and a French father, so his very first months were in France, but disaster struck within a year, 18 months of his birth. His father died only in his 40s. France was invaded and defeated by the Prussians, and revolution broke out in Paris, leading to the first short-lived communist government in the world, a revolution that was put down with great brutality. And although these events all happened at a time Belloc was too young to understand or even to remember, they had their impact on him, and he remained moulded by those events. The fact that he was effectively an exile. His mother came back to England. She had some money which she entrusted to a friend to invest for her, and either he embezzled it or he lost it all through unwise investment. So Madame Belloc had to find somewhere to live within her means, and that's what brought her to Sussex and to Slindon. Now today, properties in West Sussex villages are very expensive. If you have a property in a West Sussex village, you are an affluent, well-off person. But back then, in the early 1870s, villages were still really thought of as places where the rural poor lived. It was in the cities and the fashionable parts of towns where properties were most expensive. So she came and lived in Slindon, and that's where Belloc grew up. And he always felt himself an outsider. Was he French? Was he English? He was also Catholic, and that marked him out. Respectable people, generally speaking, weren't Roman Catholic. Respectable middle-class people were Anglicans. And as Belloc grew up, his Catholicism became stronger and stronger to him, perhaps because it gave him some sense of continuity in a world that seemed unreliable, ever-changing, vulnerable. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that Sussex became very important to him. But it was a Sussex that he remembered as a boy, the Sussex of rural labourers, of rural customs and traditions, of men in old pubs drinking old beer. Men who spoke with Sussex accents, that used words that were unfamiliar to the respectable classes, used words that perhaps went way back in time, even to the Anglo-Saxon origin of England and the county of Sussex. So as well as his Catholicism, we find constant repeating theme of Sussex, its ruralness, its uniqueness, its independence of spirit. But as Belloc grew older, and particularly in the years after the First World War, he saw the Sussex he loved disappearing. He saw London influencing the county more and more. He saw the middle-class, affluent people changing things. And the working class became more Cockney than Sussex, as there was this great emigration out of London down to, first of all, the south coast, and then Sussex more generally. And he wrote a poem in which all these sentiments and feelings come to the fore. It's a poem that's one of his most loved, and it's called The South Country. When I'm living in the Midlands that are sodden and unkind, I light my lamp in the evening, my work is left behind. And the great hills of the South Country come back into my mind. The great hills of the South Country, they stand along the sea, and it's there walking in the high woods that I would wish to be. And the men that were boys when I was a boy, walking along with me. The men that live in North England, I saw them for a day. Their hearts are set upon the waste fells, their skies are fast and grey. From their castle walls a man may see the mountains far away. The men that live in West England, they see the Severn strong, a rolling on rough water brown, light aspen leaves along. They have the secret of the rocks and the oldest kind of song. But the men that live in the South Country are the kindest and most wise. They get their laughter from the loud surf, and the faith in their happy eyes comes surely from our sister the spring, when over the sea she flies. The violets suddenly bloom at her feet. She blesses us with surprise. I never get between the pines, but I smell the Sussex air, nor I never come on a belt of sand, but my home is there. And along the sky the line of the downs, so noble and so bare. A lost thing could I never find, nor a broken thing mend, and I fear I shall be all alone when I get towards the end. Who shall be there to comfort me, or who shall be my friend? I will gather and carefully make my friends of the men of the Sussex Weald. They watch the stars from silent folds, they stiffly plough the field. By them and the God of the South Country my poor soul shall be healed. If ever I become a rich man, or if ever I grow to be old, I will build a house of deepest thatch to shelter me from the cold, and there shall the Sussex songs be sung and the story of Sussex told. I will hold my house in the high wood within a walk of the sea, and the men that were boys when I was a boy shall sit and drink with me. So we're in St Mary's Church at Slindon, and Slindon was the village where Hilaire Belloc grew up as a boy, and he would have known this church and this effigy, this wooden effigy of a medieval knight, arguably one of the last of the medieval knights. This is Sir Anthony St Ledger, who died in 1539. He may have been one of the last men to have fought in the Wars of the Roses. And certainly the age of chivalry was passing. And Hilaire Belloc, as a 9-year-old boy, was affected by looking at this effigy, and he wrote the following verse. There is no name upon his grave, if his grave it haps to be, and his face doth look towards the plain and towards the calm blue sea. He lies in a quiet church aisle, with a small churchyard in view, by a little Gothic window, and 'neath a shady yew. He may have been carved for ages, and oft heard the tolling bell, and he may lay there for ages more, in that church aisle, who can tell? There is no name upon his grave, if his grave it haps to be, and his face doth look towards the plain, and towards the calm blue sea. Not bad for a 9-year-old. So this is Bleak House at Slindon, and as you can see, it's a strange house, as most of the windows have been bricked up. Very unusual. Hilaire Belloc grew up in Slindon as a child and composed the poem about St Anthony Ledger. And when he was a man and when he was married and had children, he came here with his wife Elodie in 1903, but she did not enjoy living in Bleak House, and within a year they moved to Shipley. Hilaire Belloc expressed himself religiously in a very simple way. Although he'd been to Oxford University and was by any standards an extremely intelligent, well-read and thoughtful man, his religion was always expressed in a simple way, rather like a European peasant farmer might express himself. And Belloc was very suspicious of religious beliefs that were too complicated. He thought the simple was the nearest to God. And I think that's expressed well in his poem Twelfth Night. As I was lifting over down a winter's night to Petworth town, I came upon a company of travellers who would talk with me. The riding moon was small and bright, they cast no shadows in her light. There was no man for miles anear, I would not walk with them for fear. A star in heaven by Gumber glowed, an ox across the darkness lowed, whereat a burning light there stood, right in the heart of Gumber Wood. Across the rhyme their marching rang, and in a little while they sang a song I used to know, Gloria in excelsis Domino. The frozen way those people trod, it led towards the Mother of God. Perhaps if I had travelled with them, I might have come to Bethlehem. Belloc also saw in religion the promise of justice, and justice was a very recurring theme in his writings and in his beliefs. He wrote a poem called The Poor of London that expresses this really vividly. Almighty God, whose justice like a sun shall coruscate along the floors of heaven, raising what's low, perfecting what's undone, breaking the proud and making odd things even. The poor of Jesus Christ along the street, in your rain sodden, in your snows unshod, they have nor hearth nor sword nor human meat, not even the bread of man, Almighty God. The poor of Jesus Christ, whom no man hears, have waited on your vengeance much too long. Wipe out not tears, but blood, our eyes bleed tears. Come smite our damned sophistries so strong, that thy rude hammer, battering this rude wrong, ring down the abyss of twice 10,000 years. And in that poem we get sombre Belloc, angry Belloc, Belloc who is looking for justice for those who've been denied it so long. But he could also be comical, and sometimes his co-religionists were rather aghast at what they saw as his almost blasphemous comments. There is an anecdote that tells of Belloc in discussion with Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, with whom he had much in common but also had strong disagreements, and his disagreements were really religious. And in exasperation, one of them, either Wells or Bernard Shaw, said, "Belloc, how can you possibly believe the Jesuits when they tell you the bread turns into the body of Christ and the wine turns into the blood of Christ?" And Belloc said straight away, "If they told me it turned into elephants' droppings, I'd believe them." Which, as you can see, might go down quite badly with both atheists and the religiously devout. He also wrote a song that could be taken as offensive, but really shows that in the end, for all his seriousness, it was humour and levity that got him through life, and he had many things to contend with in his life. So this little song is his carol, Noel. Noel, 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 a Catholic tale have I to tell, and a Christian song have I to sing, when all the bells in Arundel ring. I pray good beef and I pray good beer, this holy night of all the year, but I pray detestable health to them that give no honour to Bethlehem. May all good fellows that here agree, drink audit hail in heaven with me, and may all my enemies go to hell. Noel, 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 may all my enemies go to hell. Noel, Noel. So returning to this idea of injustice, I think we've seen already that for Belloc, injustice wasn't just political, it was theological. Belloc was very influenced by Cardinal Manning, who said essentially all conflict is theological, that there is this constant tussle between good and evil. And one of the great evils, Belloc thought, was the dispossession of people from the land, that originally all had the land, and the land was not something that was just in the keep of a privileged few. And this idea we find appearing again and again in his writings. So in The Four Men, his great Sussex book, he notes that despite the abundance of land, it is not available to everyone. All the land which is knit in with our flesh, and yet in which a man cannot find an acre nor a wall of his own. And in one of his poems, The Rebel, he writes, "There is a wall of which the stones are lies and bribes and dead men's bones, and wrongfully this evil wall denies what all men made for all, and shamelessly this wall surrounds our homesteads and our native grounds." And certainly in Belloc's time, the ownership of the land by a few became a source of great political controversy. The fact that country landowners put up huge walls to deny people access in the 18th century enclosure by the Duke of Newcastle of Ashdown Forest led to the people there being dispossessed, to becoming sort of semi-itinerants. And one thing that really annoyed Belloc was smug self-regard of the rich and privileged, and that comes out very much in his poem The Justice of the Peace, in which he mocks the pretensions of the country landowner and local magistrate. Distinguish carefully between these two. This thing is yours, that other thing is mine. You have a shirt, a brimless hat, a shoe, and half a coat. I am the Lord benign of 50 acres of fat land, to which I have a right. Do you understand? I have a right because I have a right. Now be quite calm and good. Obey the laws. Remember your low station. Do not fight against the goad, because you know it pricks whenever the uncleanly demos kicks. I do not envy you your hat, your shoe. Why should you envy me my small estate? It's fearfully illogical in you to fight with economic force and fate. Moreover, I have got the upper hand, and I mean to keep it. Do you understand? This might lead you to think that Belloc was a communist revolutionary, but actually in the 1920s and 30s he was a fierce opponent of Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution. Why? Because he did not see communism as liberating people, but merely imprisoning them in a different form. Under the communists in Russia, the land was nationalized, and so effectively everyone became employees of the government. That wasn't the freedom Belloc desired. He and his great friend and associate G.K. Chesterton came up with the idea of distributism, that the land should be distributed amongst the people, not held in common, but held by families. And the reason that Belloc thought this led to freedom was because if a family had enough land to feed themselves, they were free, economically free. If they wanted to work with others, they could. If they wanted to do this or do that, it was up to them. But they were not compelled, whereas in the modern world, Belloc argued, everyone was compelled to work for somebody else if they wanted to survive in the world. And he also saw how the financial system in the West was growing more and more powerful, particularly the banking system. There will come a time, he warned, when everyone will be slaves of the bankers. And I remember thinking when we had the financial crisis 10 or 11 years ago, and I believe it worked out that every single family in Britain contributed £38,000 to the bailout of the banks. And for a time they were ours. And then of course they were sold back to the bankers, not at the best possible price. Did we ever get our £38,000 back? I don't think so. So Belloc today would look around and still feel that we were no nearer the true freedom that he argued and believed in. here we are at Upwaltham Church, deep in the South Downs. Still quite isolated today, although you hear the modern traffic go by. Back in the first part of the 19th century, this would have been really remote. And the rector of Graffham, Reverend Henry Manning, used to walk here to conduct services for the agricultural labourers and shepherds and so forth. Manning became famous later when he left the Anglican Church and became a Roman Catholic, becoming a Roman Catholic cardinal. And famously as Cardinal Manning, he went down and administered during the Great Dock Strike of 1889. So he didn't exactly come out on side of the dockers, but he gave them spiritual comfort and encouragement, which led to the dock owners agreeing better wages for the dockers. So he was very popular down there. And it's interesting because Manning, of course, was a great hero of Hilaire Belloc, and Belloc thought that Manning carried on as a Christian should, and that he was a good example. So another South Downs connection with Hilaire Belloc. I've talked about Belloc the Catholic, I've talked about Belloc the political person, Belloc the man who loved Sussex, but there was also a part of him that was pagan. I went to a conference getting on for 20 years ago now about Belloc, and there were a lot of Catholic priests there, a lot of people who were heavily involved in the Catholic Church, and I was talking to one of the priests and he said, well, it was really, Belloc was a pagan. And he's often referring to paganism in antiquity, the Greeks, the Romans, but also that sort of earthy folk culture that may or may not have been linked to paganism's inverted commas, because we don't really know what the religious beliefs were of people who lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago, because they had no writing. So there's a lot of supposition and conjecture. But what I think we can say about Belloc was that he had a sense of history and of the past, which also gave him a sense of the future. So later on I'll be talking about how Belloc saw the world going after his own lifetime, and it's quite surprising and interesting how right he was in many of his predictions. And he even said, my love of history, my love of the past, is because it makes me greater than myself, my small life of 70 or 80 years. I'm in communion with all those that went before me. And a lot of this was intellectual through his studying of history, but a lot, I think, was also instinctive. He picked up things that perhaps other people didn't notice or weren't aware of. Now, in his book, The Four Men, which is the book that of all the books he wrote, it's the one he loved the most, along with his other book, The Path to Rome. The Path to Rome and The Four Men really are the two books. If you read Belloc books, they're the two to read. If you haven't got time to read the others, read those two. And The Four Men is set in Sussex, and it describes a journey of four companions, all of whom meet by chance. They've never known each other before. By sheer luck, they meet each other and they join together, and they walk across Sussex, starting in Robertsbridge in the east and ending at South Harting. The Four Men is a book you need to read at least twice to begin to understand it, because there's a seriousness to it, but there's also a playfulness, a joyfulness, and it takes some getting used to how Belloc will move from the sombre to the light and the jovial. And there's one passage in The Four Men where the companions, after a long day walking, find themselves somewhere to sleep, a sort of a hut in the countryside, and they're able to make a fire and warm themselves, and gradually the four companions all nod off to sleep, and it happens to be Halloween, and the only character that is not asleep is the one called Myself. And Myself is the character that begins the novel. He is sitting alone in the inn at Robertsbridge, drinking port, when he's disturbed by an old man called Grizzlebeard. And later they meet another companion, the sailor, and then the last one, the poet. And a lot of Belloc's biographers believe that actually these four men were all aspects of Belloc's own personality. Myself is him at the time he wrote the novel, when he was in early middle age. Grizzlebeard is the man he imagined becoming when he was old. The poet was what he always wanted to be when he was young, and he felt his poetry was never good enough to be great. And then the sailor is the playful Belloc. Belloc had a yacht called the Nona, which often he sailed out of Littlehampton Harbour, and which we'll be coming back to again later in this talk. And Belloc was most at ease, most himself, most free of the cares of the world when he was on his... I say it was a yacht, it was more of an old lugger really. He was most free when he was at sea. But in the four men, at this moment, when the other companions are nodding off to sleep, myself cannot sleep, and he goes out to view the night. And there is something in this that is really quite pagan. So Belloc is describing his companions falling to sleep, and he says, "They had in their minds that all Halloween as sleep took them, the forest of the highland and the great weald all spread below, and the road downward into it, and our arrival beneath the nightly majesty of the downs. They took their rest before the fire. But I was still wakeful, all alone, remembering All Hallows and what dancing there was in the woods that night, though no man living might hear the music or see the dancers go. I thought the firelit darkness was alive, so I slipped to the door very quietly, covering the latch with my fingers to dumb its noise, and I went out and watched the world. The moon stood over Chanctonbury, so removed and cold in her silver that you might almost have thought her careless of the follies of men. Little clouds, her attendants, shone beneath her worshipping, and they presided together over a general silence. Her light caught the edges of the downs. There was no mist. She was still frosty clear when I saw her set behind those hills. The stars were more brilliant after her setting, and deep quiet held the valley of Ada, my little river, slipping at low tide towards the sea. When I had seen all this, I went back within doors as noiselessly as I had come out, and I picked through the sleepers to my own place, and I wrapped myself in my cloak before the fire. Sleep came at last to me also, but that night dead friends visited me in dreams. The moon was regarded as very holy by the Anglo-Saxons in the period before Christianity came to these countries. It always delighted Belloc that Sussex was the last place in England that converted to Christianity, it's true, and it's surprising given that Kent was the first part of England to convert to Christianity, but actually Northumbria became Christian before Sussex, and that was because the county of Sussex was incredibly isolated by the great forest of the Weald to the north, by Romney Marsh to the east that was much more extensive and treacherous than it is today, and then to the west you had the Chichester Levels, Chichester Harbour and so forth, which again was a difficult terrain to cross, and then the sea to the south. So for a long time the county of Sussex was surprisingly isolated, a small population and poor. And when you think today Sussex is a very affluent county and overpopulated, 1.5 million people in Sussex. Back in antiquity, if there were 50,000, that's probably pushing the number. And somehow Belloc was aware of that. He sensed the past, and he particularly sensed it in ancient places, in forest groves, on hilltops, as in that extract from The Four Men when he talks about the Downs and Chanctonbury. He wrote a poem called The Moon's Funeral, and you can judge it for yourself. It seems to me that it's a reflection, a sadness on the passing of the old beliefs. The moon is dead, I saw her die. She in a drifting cloud was dressed. She lay along the uncertain west, a dream to see. And very low she spake to me, I go where none may understand. I fade into the nameless land, and therefore must lie perpetually. And therefore I, and therefore loudly, loudly I, and high and very piteously make cry. The moon is dead, I saw her die. And will she never rise again, the holy moon? Oh, never more. Perhaps along the inhuman shore, where pale ghosts are, beyond the low Lethean fen, she and some wide infernal star. To us who loved her nevermore, the moon will never rise again. Oh, nevermore in nightly sky her eyes so high shall peep and pry, to see the great world rolling by. For why? The moon is dead, I saw her die. Perhaps a poem just about the waxing and waning of the moon, or perhaps about something more profound. Who can tell? When Belloc was a young man, he served his 1 year military service in the French army. Even though he was obviously living in England, he still felt obliged to do that. And even as an old man, he'd refer back to his barrack room days. Now, he could never recapture that. That was something that was in his past. But what he could keep returning to was the sea and to his various boats. I mentioned the Nona. He also had another one called the Dreadnought. Some of you will know, of course, that the very powerful, massive First World War British battleships were called Dreadnoughts. And his boat certainly wasn't one of those. We have some lovely descriptions of Belloc on his boat from those who knew him and who wrote down memoirs, including J.B. Morton. And I'm going to read you some of J.B. Morton's descriptions of sailing with Belloc in the Dreadnought. Belloc had a second boat, an extraordinary sort of tub which he occasionally took out. It was said that when the wind blew, this strange craft moved sideways across the water. She was, at this time, at Littlehampton, and one Sunday at Kingsland after Mass, Belloc said, "We'll go down to Littlehampton and bring the Dreadnought." That was her proud name. Up the river to Arundel. There's a man there who can look after her. So off to Littlehampton we went, found the Dreadnought, hoisted sail and set out to negotiate the tricky reaches and curves of the Arun. I tried to do what I was told, but somewhere near Ford we ran aground. We got overboard and endeavoured to push her clear, but she was firmly wedged in the mud, so we sat in a meadow and smoked, waiting for the tide to lift her off. There was also drama at Arundel, where Morton ended up falling into the river as they were trying to moor the boat. I gripped the hook, held myself tense, and as we came abreast of the post I had chosen, struck fiercely. The hook caught the post and I relaxed my effort and made ready the rope in my other hand. The boat went on, the hook slipped and I fell overboard into the Arun. The last words I heard from Belloc have become famous in my family. He shouted, "Are you drowning, my boy?" And I shouted back, "No, I'm all right." I scrambled out of the water and rejoined my skipper in the hotel. We drank port and he made no reference to my imbecility. But standing in the window of the room where we were drinking, he looked down the river and said, "I will now compare human life to a river," which he did in a long, passionate passage of rhetoric. So many men mixed in Belloc that his variety was inexhaustible, and there could never be a dull moment. In the flattest calm you were not bored, because he would turn to that or any other misadventure into a jest. When we grew weary of talking, he would sing. Many were his own songs, also ribaldries from the French barrack rooms of his youth, and old music hall songs. Echoes of them come to me now as I write, and I see his blue eyes glinting with laughter, and I hear the light tenor voice which came so surprisingly from a man of his build. Belloc himself wrote of the impact of the sea on him and how it helped him reflect and think on things. He described being in his boat on his own outside the harbour mouth on a warm summer evening. A great full moon rose up out of the east, out of the seas of England, and the night was warm. There was a sort of holiness about the air. I was even glad that we had thus to lie outside under such a calm and softly radiant sky, with its few stars paling before their queen. In his book, The Cruise of the Nona, Belloc reflects on the power of the sea and its significance for him. There on the sea, he wrote, is a man nearest to his own making, and in communion with that from which he came and to which he shall return. For the wise men of very long ago have said, and it is true, that out of salt water all things came. The sea is the matrix of creation, and we have the memory of it in our blood. The sea has taken me to itself whenever I sought it, and it has given me relief from men. It has rendered remote the cares and the wastes of the land. For of all the creatures that move and breathe upon the earth, mankind are the most fullest of sorrow. But the sea shall comfort us, and perpetually show us new things and assure us. It is the common sacrament of this world. May it be to others what it has been to me. And lastly, in talking about the sea, we come back to his Catholicism, and this Catholicism being, as we have said, strangely mixed with pagan ideas. This is a poem called In a Boat, and it may well have been written after a rather disastrous day at sea off Bardsey Island in North Wales. Bardsey Sound is notorious for the strength of its currents, and in a very wild piece of weather, Belloc thought his boat nearly sunk and him with it. So possibly he wrote this poem after that incident, and it brings together his ideas of the sea, his ideas of religion, and his ideas of nature. In a Boat. Lady, lady, upon heaven height, above the harsh morning, in the mere light, above the spindrift and above the snow, where no seas tumble and no winds blow, the twisting tides and the perilous sands upon all sides are in your holy hands. The wind harries and the cold kills, but I see your chapel over far hills. My body is frozen, my soul is afraid. Stretch out your hands to me, mother and maid. Mother of Christ and mother of me, save me alive from the howl of the sea. If you will mother me till I grow old, I will hang in your chapel a ship of pure gold. So here we are in a churchyard. Death was always pretty close to Belloc's thoughts, and his singing, his nonsense rhymes, his jovial company were in a way always keeping that thought at bay. As I said at the beginning of the talk, his father died when he was very young. His wife, who he loved deeply and went to great pains to win her hand, died when she was only in her mid-40s, just before the outbreak of the First World War. He lost his eldest son during the First World War and his second son at the beginning of the Second World War, so he was very familiar with grief. And Belloc had a total acceptance and belief of the supernatural. He didn't try and explain it. He wasn't interested in going to seances or fortune tellers. He just accepted that there were things that happened in life that were inexplicable. During the height of his fame, when he was writing books and articles constantly, sometimes wealthy friends would allow him to go to their houses where he would dictate to Ruby Goldsmith, his secretary, and he would dictate at great speed, and sometimes he'd write a whole book off the top of his head. A remarkable thing. And Belloc was aware that a lot of these books were written at great speed and for cash. And there was a story about him being on a train once, and a man opposite him in the carriage was reading one of Belloc's books, and Belloc leaned over and said, "Excuse me, sir, how much did you pay for that book?" And the man said, £0.50. So Belloc took out £0.50 from his pocket, put it in his hand, grabbed the book and threw it out the window. "Absolute rubbish," he said, which is a typical Bellocian story. But on one of these occasions, when he was dictating a book to Ruby Goldsmith, they were in the library of a large house, and the family had left them to get on with their work. No one else in the entire house. And Belloc was dictating as usual, and then Ruby Goldsmith became aware of a sound. And as she listened, she realised it was the sound of a child crying out. But Belloc kept dictating, and the sound of the crying child got louder to such a degree that in the end the woman said, "Mr. Belloc, excuse me, but I think there's a child crying." And Belloc stopped. "Oh, yes, I believe there is." "Well, I think, Mr. Belloc, we ought to go and investigate." So they went out into the landing, no sound. They went out into other rooms, no sound. Came back into the library, the sound of the child crying, and Miss Goldsmith was frightened and said, I don't think this is anything human, Mr. Belloc. I think it's something spectral." And Belloc said, "Yes, and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it," and carried on dictating, but more loudly to drown out the sound of this spectral crying. And that is given as an example of how Belloc just accepted these things, and as he said, there's nothing we can do about it. He often seemed to have premonitions. Now they could just be terms of what the future might hold, and as I said, he warned that one day everyone will become slaves to the bankers. He also in the 1920s appeared totally eccentric when he said everyone's worrying about the rise of fascism and the rise of Bolshevism, but nobody seems to worry about the burning flame of Islam, which he was sure would come back to be a challenge to Western society and values. And of course that doesn't seem nearly as crazy now. But the most powerful thing that perhaps happened was before his wife died, before he knew she was ill, before the First World War broke out, before anyone knew war was coming, Belloc drove from his home at Shipley to visit his mother at Slindon, and in passing Hare Hill he noticed that the great storm of the night before had blown down part of the windmill, and he stopped and just burst into tears, and later wrote the poem Hare Mill. And he and others have thought in retrospect that the poem is a premonition of disaster, personal disaster, the loss of his wife, the loss of his son, but national disaster, that although England won the war, English rural life would never return. It would never be what it was before, and that real England was passing into oblivion. And he also put the poem to a tune, which I will sing to you, and it's plaintive, and I think it's quite clear that this is speaking of a lot more than a lost windmill. And the windmill was referred to amongst the country people as Sally. Sally is gone that was so kindly, Sally is gone from Hare Hill, and the briar grows ever since then so blindly, and ever since then the clapper is still, and the sweeps have fallen from Hare mill. Hare hill is in desolation, ruin atop and a field unploughed, and spirits that call on a fallen nation, spirits that loved her calling aloud, spirits abroad in a windy cloud, spirits that call but no one answers. Hare's down and England's done, wind and thistle for pipe and dancers, and never a ploughman under the sun, never a ploughman, never a one. I'm going to end by reading you the last passage of the Four Men. This is where the four companions have parted from each other for the last time, and myself, Belloc, goes up onto the downs, and he looks around at the view out to the sea and over the Weald. And I think this really speaks for itself. The haze had gone, the sky was faint and wintry, but pure throughout its circle, and above the channel hung largely the round of the moon, still pale because the dark had not yet come. But though she had been worshipped so often upon such evenings and from such a place, a greater thing now moved and took me from her, and turning round I looked north from the ridge of the steep escarpment, over the plains to the rivers and the roofs of the Weald. I would have blessed them had I known some form of word or spell which might convey an active benediction, but as I knew none such, I repeated instead the list of their names to serve in place of a prayer. The river Arun, a valley of sacred water, an amberly wild brook which is lonely with reeds at evening, and Burton great house where I have spent nights in November, and Lavington, and also hidden Byworth and Fittleworth next on, and Egdean side, all heath and air, and the lake and the pine trees at the mill, and Petworth little town, all the land which is knitting with our flesh, and yet in which a man cannot find an acre nor a wall of his own. I knew as this affection urged me that verse alone would satisfy something at least of that irredeemable desire. I lay down therefore at full length upon the short grass, which the sheep also love, and taking out a little stump of pencil that I had, and tearing off the back of a letter, I held my words and prepared. My metre, which at first eluded me, though it had been with me many hours, was given me by these chance lines that came. And therefore even youth that dies may leave of right its legacies. I put my pencil upon the paper doubtfully, and drew little lines, considering my theme. But I would not long hesitate in this manner, for I knew that all creation must be chaos first, and then gestures in the void before it can be cast out, the completed thing. But if a man is part of, and is rooted in one steadfast piece of earth, which has nourished him and given him his being, and if he can lend it glory and do it service, I thought, it will be a friend to him forever, and he has outflanked death in a way. And I shall pass, thought I, but this shall stand almost as long as no man's land. No, certainly, I answered to myself aloud, he does not die. Then from that phrase there ran the fugue, and my last stanzas stood out clear at once, complete and full, and I wrote them down as rapidly as writing could go. He does not die that can bequeath some influence to the land he knows, or dares, persistent, interwreath, love permanent with the wild hedgerows. He does not die, but still remains substantiate with his darling plains. The spring's superb adventure calls, his dust athwart the woods to flame, his boundary river's secret falls, perpetuate and repeat his name. He rides his loud October sky, he does not die, he does not die. The beeches know the accustomed head which loved them, and in a people dare, beneath their benedictions spread, comforts the silence everywhere. For native ghosts return, and these perfect the mystery in the trees. So therefore, though myself be crossed, the shuddering of that dreadful day, when friend and fire are home and lost, and even children drawn away, the passer-by shall hear me still, a boy that sings on Duncton Hill. So I've come to the end of my short journey through the life of Hilaire Belloc. I hope it's been of interest. If you carry on watching this film, what follows now is a film we recorded last July the 27th, which was the 150th anniversary of the birth of Hilaire Belloc, and we had a little event at Shipley. We unveiled a sign, an information sign about Belloc. I said a few words, the Reverend Nick Flint said a few words, and so did Charlie Eustace, who is Belloc's great-grandson and still lives at Kingsland at Shipley. So that house has been in the family ownership now for getting on 120 years. So if you'd like to watch that, please do. And it ends with some songs, some Belloc songs, and John Godfrey reading Hare Hill. So yes, I hope you've enjoyed this, and you can find a lot more about Hilaire Belloc at the website www.belloc-broadwood.org.uk. And I hope you enjoy reading Belloc and learning more about him. Thank you.
It's a privilege to be standing here today to welcome you on this auspicious date, 150th birthday of Hilaire Belloc. I have to say, however, that the weather is disappointing. And when it started to get sunny, even sunny earlier on, I went into my daughter's room and I said, well, this won't do. This won't do at all. What I mean is there should be, well, there are some dark clouds overhead, but there should be, properly speaking, a brewing storm. And above all, there should be bellowing, Bellocian crashes of thunder. For so, we are told, was the birth of Hilaire Belloc announced with ominous thunderclap, born in the middle of a storm. That is how legend has it. As fitting for one who lived through tumultuous times and contributed himself in no small part to some of the clashes and controversies of the age, and never shied away from loudly expressing his not always popular opinions. So where's the thunder?
I'm Charlie Eustace. My mother was a Miss Belloc, so that explains the connection. Her grandfather was Hilaire. I came here as a boy, and every room had a candle and a bottle of water and a crucifix in case you should need a prayer in the middle of the night. But there was no electricity. That was 1963. And then I came here in 1970, and we went to the party in the tent here on what was called the paddock, where people who remembered Belloc were there, people who were looking after the royalties were there. It was his 100th birthday. I never thought that 8 years later I would come to look after the house when my Aunt Eleanor, who was herself referred to in the family as a bit of a caution. She was quite a character, a lot of amusing stories. She was very good with children. Needed looking after, and went to stay with another aunt over in Newbury, and I came here, and I've been here ever since in one form or another. But I'm really here to unveil this, and there's a funny story about unveiling that Johnny Morton was asked to unveil the plaque on the mill to Hilaire Belloc at the time, and it snagged, so I hope this one doesn't. But he said, as he knew Belloc, they used to meet in a pub in Horsham, not surprisingly, that Mr. Belloc would have thought that was perfectly all right, because, you know, things do go wrong, and it sort of made everybody look a bit uncomfortable for a moment or two. But then it was Belloc's sort of calling in life to make people feel slightly uncomfortable. And with that, Nick, if that's all right, I will pull the grip cord.
Morton knew Belloc when Belloc was from his late 50s onwards, so he knew him as an older man. This is Morton talking about travelling with Hilaire Belloc. When you travelled abroad with Belloc, you had not one companion but several: the historian, the poet, the soldier, and the man of wide culture who was passionately interested in architecture, in people, in food and drink. And what was he like to behold? To get a picture of him on such occasions, one must see a square-shouldered, thick-set figure dressed in black broadcloth, black hat, black tie and stiff collar. He carries a very old portmanteau. His pockets are stuffed with papers. He moves rapidly with an aggressive half-run, half-walk, his feet shuffling along the ground. He will be cursing as he goes along, but in the merriest fashion.
I rode him out of Wantage, and I rode him up the hill. And there I saw the beacon in the morning standing still. Ink pen and hank pen and southward and away. High through the midlands in the strengthening of the day. I thank my God for this at the least. I was born in the west and not in the east, and he made me a human instead of a beast, whose hide is covered with hair.
Sally is gone that was so kindly. Sally is gone from Hare Hill, and the briar grows ever since then so blindly, and ever since then the clapper is still, and the sweeps have fallen from Hare Mill. Hare Hill is in desolation, ruin atop and a field unploughed, and spirits that call on a fallen nation, spirits that loved her calling aloud, spirits abroad in a windy cloud, spirits that call and no one answers. Haneke's down and England's done. Wind and thistle for pipe and dancers, and never a ploughman under the sun. Never a ploughman, never a one.